I found my fiancé's old diary where he detailed the perfect wife checklist. I failed every single requirement. His best friend didn't. Colin's parents were downsizing from their family home to a condo, and his mom asked if we could help clear out his childhood bedroom before the movers came. I said yes, because I actually liked his parents and figured it would be nice to see where Colin grew up. The room was frozen in time from when he left for college, posters of basketball players still taped to the walls and trophies lined up on shelves collecting dust. His mom handed me a box and told me to sort through the books on his shelf, keep anything he might want, and donate the rest. I was pulling out old textbooks and paperbacks when my hand hit something wedged behind the bookshelf. A leather journal with his name written on the cover in a 12-year-old's handwriting. I sat on his old bed and opened it, expecting to find typical teenage angst or embarrassing crushes. Instead, the first page had a title written in careful block letters, "My future wife must have." My stomach did a weird flip as I started reading the list underneath. Blonde hair, not too short. Loves watching sports and playing them. Wants exactly 3 children, no more, no less. Goes to church every Sunday and believes in God. Never raises her voice or starts arguments. Stays home to take care of the house and kids. Always agrees with her husband's decisions and supports him. Pretty but not too pretty that other men look. The list went on for 2 full pages with specific requirements about height and body type and hobbies and personality traits. I felt my face getting hot as I read because I failed literally every single one. My hair is dark brown and I keep it short because it's easier. I hate sports and never understood why people cared so much about watching other people play games. I've been clear with Colin since our second date that I don't want kids, and he always said that was fine. I'm agnostic and haven't been to church since my grandmother's funeral 5 years ago. I'm opinionated and loud, and we've had plenty of arguments where I definitely raised my voice. I have a career I love and fully plan to keep working. And I question Colin's decisions all the time because that's what partners do. I laughed out loud sitting there in his childhood bedroom because the whole thing was absurd. Colin was 12 when he wrote this, probably influenced by whatever his parents' relationship looked like or some idealized version of marriage he saw on TV. Kids say stupid things about who they'll marry. I remember being 8 and declaring I'd only marry someone who owned a horse ranch. The journal was juvenile nonsense, and I was about to put it back when I noticed the dates. Colin had dated each entry, and this wasn't just from when he was 12. The entries continued for years, all the way through high school, with updates and refinements to his perfect wife criteria. By age 16, he'd added college education requirements and specifications about cooking skills. At 18, he'd written a whole section about how his future wife should handle finances and household management. I flipped faster through the pages, feeling less amused and more unsettled. This wasn't a child's fantasy. This was a detailed blueprint he'd maintained and updated for years. The last entry in the journal was dated during his sophomore year of college, right before he met me. It summarized the entire checklist into categories with point values assigned to each requirement. Physical appearance was worth 30 points. Religious beliefs and family values were worth 40. Personality and temperament were worth 30. He'd created a scoring system for evaluating potential partners like they were job applicants. I felt sick reading it, but I couldn't stop. At the very bottom of the page, he'd written a note to himself. Don't settle for less than 75 points total. The right woman is worth waiting for. Mom and Dad's marriage works because Dad chose someone who fit all the requirements. Do the same. I snapped the journal shut and shoved it in my purse before his mom could come back and see what I'd found. My hands were shaking and my mind was racing through our entire relationship, wondering if Colin had been scoring me this whole time and whether I'd passed his test or failed it. That night, after we got back to our apartment, I waited until Colin was in the shower and pulled out the journal again. I needed to reread it to make sure I hadn't misunderstood or overreacted. But reading it a second time just confirmed what I'd seen. 12-year-old Colin had created an impossible standard for his future wife and had apparently held onto it through his entire adolescence. I kept thinking about how many times he'd told me I was perfect for him and how much he loved everything about me. Had he been lying? Had he spent 3 years with me despite me being the opposite of everything on his list? I heard the shower turn off and shoved the journal under the couch cushions. Colin came out in sweatpants with his hair dripping and asked if I wanted to order Thai food. I said sure and pretended everything was normal, while my stomach churned with questions I didn't know how to ask. How do you bring up a journal your fiancé wrote as a kid without sounding crazy and insecure? I couldn't sleep that night, and around 2 a.m. I gave up and moved to the living room so I wouldn't wake Colin. I pulled out the journal again, and this time I looked more carefully at the dates and handwriting. The entries from age 12 through high school were in blue pen with that careful kid handwriting. But there were newer entries too that I'd missed before, tucked in the back pages written in Colin's current handwriting with black ink. My heart started pounding as I flipped to them. The most recent entry was dated 6 months ago. 6 months ago, after he'd already proposed, after we'd already set a wedding date and booked a venue. The entry was titled Reality Check, and I felt my hands start shaking before I even started reading. He'd rewritten his entire childhood list at the top of the page with check marks next to each item. Then below it, he'd written my name with scores next to each category. Physical appearance, 6 out of 30. Religious beliefs and family values, 2 out of 40. Personality and temperament, 8 out of 30. Total, 16 out of 100. I had to put the journal down because I felt like I might throw up. 16 out of 100. He'd scored me at 16% compared to his ideal wife. I picked it up again because I needed to see what else he'd written. Below my pathetically low score, he'd written a paragraph that made everything so much worse. Still struggling with the decision to marry someone who scores this low. She's not what I planned for, but she's what's available right now. Mallory would score at least 85 out of 100, but she's been with Trevor for 2 years and seems happy. Can't wait forever. Need to move forward with life even if it means compromising on the original requirements. Maybe I'll grow to accept the differences. Maybe scores don't matter as much as I thought they did when I was younger. But it's hard not to compare what I have to what I could have had if circumstances were different. I read that paragraph 5 times, and it still didn't make sense. Who was Mallory? And what did he mean about her scoring 85 compared to my 16? I pulled out my laptop and opened Colin's Facebook, something I'd never felt the need to do before because I trusted him completely. I went through his friends list looking for anyone named Mallory and found her third from the top, Mallory Chen. I clicked on her profile and my stomach dropped even further. She was in dozens of photos with Colin going back to their freshman year of college, pictures of them at parties and football games and study sessions. Recent photos from the past few months showed her at our apartment for game nights and dinners, always sitting next to Colin while I was across the room or in the kitchen. I'd met Mallory probably 20 times over the past 3 years. Colin always introduced her as his best friend from college, and I'd never thought anything of it because he had lots of friends from school. But now looking at her profile, I saw everything his childhood list had demanded. Long blonde hair, athletic build from playing college soccer. Her bio mentioned coaching youth sports. Photos of her at church events. Her job title said, stay-at-home mom and loving it, even though she didn't have kids yet. I went back through the photos more carefully and felt increasingly sick. In almost every group photo, Colin was positioned next to Mallory. At our engagement party, there was a photo of Colin, Mallory, and her boyfriend Trevor all laughing together. I'd taken that photo. I remembered Mallory congratulating us and saying how happy she was for Colin. I scrolled further and found photos from a camping trip last summer that Colin had said was just guys from college. Mallory was in half the photos. He'd lied about her being there. I kept scrolling and found more lies. A weekend trip to his friend's lake house that he said was all couples from work. Mallory was there. A birthday dinner for Colin that he said was immediate family only. Mallory was sitting right next to his mom. Every time he'd hung out with Mallory, he'd downplayed it or hidden it completely. I'd thought his best friend from college was his roommate Kevin. I'd never realized Mallory was actually the person he spent the most time with outside of work. The sun was coming up when I finally closed my laptop. I'd spent 4 hours going through every photo and post, building a timeline of Colin's friendship with Mallory compared to our relationship. They'd met freshman year and been inseparable all through college. Our relationship started junior year through mutual friends. The 3 of us had overlapped at school for 2 years, and I'd barely been aware Mallory existed because Colin never mentioned her. Now I understood why. She was the girl he actually wanted, and I was the girl he'd settled for when she wasn't available. I heard Colin's alarm go off in the bedroom and knew I needed to decide what to do. Confront him? Pretend I never saw the journal? Call off the wedding? I felt paralyzed by the betrayal and couldn't think straight. Colin came out of the bedroom yawning and stopped when he saw me on the couch with his journal in my lap. His face went completely white, and I watched him realize exactly what I'd found. He started talking fast, saying it wasn't what it looked like, and I shouldn't have gone through his private things. I cut him off and asked him point blank to explain the scoring system. He stammered and said it was just a stupid thing he'd done as a kid and didn't mean anything now. I opened to the page from 6 months ago and read his entry out loud, my voice shaking on the words about me being what's available right now. Colin sat down hard on the chair across from me and put his head in his hands. The silence stretched between us until I asked the question I was terrified to hear the answer to. Was he settling for me while waiting for Mallory? He didn't answer right away, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet and his voice cracked when he said he loved me and wanted to marry me, and the journal was just him processing complicated feelings that didn't change how he felt about our relationship. I asked him again if he was in love with Mallory. This time he answered, yes. He'd been in love with her since sophomore year of college, but she'd never been single at the same time he was, and he'd eventually accepted they weren't meant to be together. I asked when he'd accepted that, and he admitted it was around the time he proposed to me. So, 6 months ago, when he'd written that journal entry about settling, he'd been planning to propose. He'd decided to marry someone who scored 16 out of 100 on his perfect wife checklist, because the woman who scored 85 was unavailable. I stood up because I couldn't sit still anymore and started pacing. I asked why he didn't just tell me the truth instead of wasting 3 years of my life being someone's backup plan. Colin stood up too and tried to reach for me, but I moved away. He said I wasn't a backup plan, and he really did love me even if I was different from what he'd imagined wanting when he was younger. He said people grow up and their priorities change, and he'd changed too. The childish list didn't matter anymore because he'd chosen me. I asked if Mallory was single right now. Would he still be choosing me? He couldn't answer, and I told him to get out. He grabbed his keys and left without another word. I called my sister as soon as the door closed and completely broke down. She listened while I ugly cried and explained the whole situation with the journal and Mallory and the scoring system. When I finally stopped talking, she was quiet for a long moment before saying I needed to leave him immediately. She offered to come help me pack and find a new place to stay. I told her I needed time to think about what I wanted to do. She said there was nothing to think about because Colin had made it clear I was his consolation prize, and I deserved better than that. After we hung up, I sat on the couch staring at the engagement ring on my finger. 3 carats in a platinum setting that Colin had been so proud of when he proposed. He'd taken me to our favorite restaurant and got down on one knee in front of everyone, and I'd been so happy thinking I was marrying someone who loved me completely. Now I knew the truth. While he was proposing, he was thinking about how I only scored 16% compared to his ideal woman. I pulled the ring off and set it on the coffee table. Then I went into our bedroom and started pulling my clothes out of the closet. My sister was right. There was nothing to think about. I couldn't marry someone who'd been keeping a scorecard of my flaws compared to another woman for 3 years. I filled 2 suitcases with essentials and called an Uber to take me to my sister's house across town. Before I left, I took a photo of the journal entry about me being what's available and texted it to Colin with a message saying the wedding was off and I'd be back for the rest of my stuff later. I blocked his number before he could respond and walked out of the apartment. In the Uber, I felt weirdly calm despite having just ended a 3-year relationship and called off my wedding. Maybe I was in shock. Maybe I was just relieved to finally understand why Colin had always seemed slightly disappointed in me even when he was telling me he loved me. Either way, I was done being someone's acceptable alternative. My sister's guest room became my home for the next 2 weeks while I figured out my next steps. I called the wedding venue and canceled, losing our deposit but not caring because it was worth it to not marry the wrong person. I reached out to our mutual friends explaining we'd broken up and I needed space. Most of them were shocked and asked what happened, but I kept it vague, saying we'd realized we weren't compatible. Only my closest friends got the full story about the journal, and they were all furious on my behalf. My best friend since high school, Imani, wanted to drive to Colin's work and confront him publicly, but I talked her down. I just wanted to move on and forget Colin existed. Getting revenge wouldn't change the fact that I'd wasted 3 years loving someone who'd been measuring me against an impossible standard the entire time. I started looking for apartments and focused on rebuilding my life as a single person. 3 weeks after I'd moved out, I got a message request on Instagram from someone I didn't follow, Mallory Chen. My first instinct was to delete it without reading, but curiosity won, and I opened it. She'd written a long message saying she needed to talk to me about Colin and could we meet for coffee. She said Colin had confessed everything to her after I left, and she felt horrible about the situation. I stared at the message for a long time before responding that I didn't see what there was to talk about since she was probably going to end up with Colin now that I was out of the picture. She wrote back immediately saying that's exactly why she needed to talk to me, to explain what actually happened. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near my sister's house the next afternoon. I told myself I was doing it for closure, even though I suspected I was just going to feel worse hearing whatever Mallory had to say. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table looking nervous. In person, she was even more like the checklist than her photos suggested. Naturally blonde hair, athletic build, wearing a cross necklace and a church volunteer t-shirt. She looked like she'd walked out of Colin's childhood journal as a living manifestation of everything he'd wanted. I sat down across from her and waited for her to start talking. She opened her purse and pulled out a stack of printed text messages. She pushed them across the table and said I needed to see these before we talked about anything else. I picked up the first page and recognized Colin's phone number at the top. The messages were between him and Mallory, going back 3 years. My hands started shaking as I read them. Colin had been texting Mallory constantly throughout our entire relationship, telling her about problems in our relationship, comparing me unfavorably to her, saying he wished she'd broken up with Trevor sooner so they could have been together instead. The most recent messages were from 2 days after I'd left. Colin had texted Mallory saying he'd broken up with me and was finally free. He asked if she wanted to get dinner and talk about giving a relationship a try. Mallory's response was harsh and direct. She told him she'd just learned what he'd done to me, how he'd kept that disgusting scoring system and used me as a placeholder while pining for her. She said she was horrified that he'd think she'd want anything to do with him after treating another woman that way. Colin had tried to explain and make excuses, but Mallory shut him down in every message. The last text from her said, "I'm blocking you now. Don't ever contact me again. What you did to her was cruel and I want no part of it." I looked up from the messages, and Mallory had tears running down her face. She said she'd broken up with Trevor a month before Colin proposed to me, but she'd never told Colin because they were just friends, and she didn't think it mattered. When Colin confessed his feelings, she'd been disgusted to learn he'd been keeping me around as backup. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to be angry at Mallory for being the perfect woman Colin had compared me to for 3 years, but she hadn't asked to be put on a pedestal or used as a measuring stick against me. She'd thought Colin was her friend, and was horrified to learn what he'd actually been doing. She pushed a napkin across the table, and I realized I was crying too. She said she was so sorry for everything, and if she'd known what Colin was doing, she would have ended their friendship years ago. She said she felt sick knowing she'd been at our engagement party and game nights while Colin was secretly wishing I was more like her. I asked why she wanted to meet with me if she'd already told Colin off. She took a deep breath and said something I absolutely didn't expect. She wanted to meet me because after seeing how Colin had talked about me in his texts, she'd looked at my social media and thought I seemed really interesting. She wanted to apologize in person and also maybe become actual friends if I was open to it. The suggestion was so absurd I almost laughed. Become friends with the woman my ex-fiancé had been obsessed with, the woman I'd been compared to and found lacking for 3 years? But then I really looked at Mallory and saw she was being genuine. She wasn't here to gloat or rub in that Colin had wanted her more. She was here because she felt guilty about unwittingly being part of my hurt even though she'd done nothing wrong. I asked what we would even have in common besides both being manipulated by Colin. She smiled slightly and said she'd read through my Instagram posts and we actually had a lot in common. We both worked in education, she as a third-grade teacher and me as a high school counselor. We both loved horror movies and hiking and trying new restaurants. She said that's what made Colin's scoring system even more ridiculous, because he'd reduced both of us to shallow physical traits and surface-level characteristics while ignoring that personality and shared interests matter more than hair color. We ended up talking for 3 hours at that coffee shop. Mallory told me about her relationship with Trevor that had been slowly dying for years, and how she'd finally ended it because she'd stopped growing as a person trying to be what he wanted. I told her about the journal and the scoring system and how devastating it was to learn I'd never been enough. She said she'd scored high on Colin's list, but that list was garbage anyway because it was based on what his 12-year-old self thought marriage should be. She said if Colin had actually tried to date her, he would have realized they were completely incompatible. She was loud and opinionated and ambitious and wanted a career. The only reason she scored well was because of superficial things like appearance and religious background. We both realized Colin had been in love with a fantasy version of Mallory that didn't actually exist, while dismissing the real me who'd been right in front of him. By the time we left the coffee shop, I actually liked Mallory and agreed to meet up again. Over the next month, Mallory and I became genuine friends. We met for coffee twice a week and went to horror movies and tried new restaurants. She introduced me to her other friends who welcomed me into their group without any weirdness about how we'd met. I introduced her to Amani, who was skeptical at first but came around after seeing how supportive Mallory was being through my breakup. Having Mallory as a friend felt like reclaiming something Colin had tried to take from me. He'd used her as a weapon against my self-esteem, but now she was proving that we didn't have to be competitors. We could be two women supporting each other instead of fighting over a man who didn't deserve either of us. I moved into my own apartment, and Mallory helped me paint and decorate. We joked about burning Colin's journal in a ceremonial friendship bonding ritual, but decided that was too much effort for something so stupid. Instead, we just moved on with our lives and stopped giving Colin any mental space. 4 months after my breakup, Mallory invited me to her friend's birthday party at a bar downtown. I almost said no because I still wasn't feeling great about being newly single at social events, but she convinced me to come. The party was fun and relaxed with good music and interesting people. I was talking to a woman named Jade about her job as a photographer when Mallory appeared with someone I vaguely recognized. She introduced him as Kieran, her friend from her church volunteer group. I remembered seeing him in some of her Instagram photos. He had dark curly hair and an easy smile, and we started talking about the documentary we'd both just watched. An hour later, we were still deep in conversation about everything from true crime podcasts to our shared experience of having siblings who drove us crazy. When the party wound down, Kieran asked if I wanted to get breakfast the next morning and continue talking. I said yes before I'd even really thought about it. Breakfast turned into a 6-hour date where we talked about our families and careers and what we wanted out of life. Kieran was a social worker who specialized in helping teens aging out of foster care. He was thoughtful and funny and asked genuine questions about my answers instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. When he walked me to my car, he asked if he could see me again. We started dating casually, nothing serious, just enjoying getting to know each other. Mallory was thrilled and kept saying she'd had a feeling we'd hit it off. 3 months into dating Kieran, he told me he was falling in love with me and everything about me was exactly what he'd been looking for. I waited for the other shoe to drop, for him to qualify it with but or except. It never came. He loved that I was opinionated and ambitious and child-free and agnostic. He loved my dark hair and my loud laugh and my tendency to argue about things I cared about. There was no checklist I was failing to meet. There was just me, being myself, and that was enough. 6 months after I'd started dating Kieran, Colin sent me a Facebook message. I'd unblocked him at some point without really thinking about it and now regretted it. The message said he'd been doing a lot of therapy and self-reflection and realized how badly he'd treated me. He wanted to apologize properly and explain that he'd been wrong about everything. He said he'd been trying to force his life to match some imaginary plan instead of appreciating what he actually had. He said breaking up was the best thing that happened to both of us because it forced him to grow up and realize his childhood fantasies about marriage were toxic. He asked if we could meet for coffee to talk. I screenshotted the message and sent it to Mallory asking what she thought. She responded immediately saying it was up to me, but Colin had sent her similar messages over the past months and she'd ignored all of them. She said he didn't deserve closure or forgiveness just because he'd been in therapy. I agreed and deleted the message without responding. Colin had taken 3 years of my life and I didn't owe him anything else. 8 months into dating Kieran, Mallory started dating someone too. His name was Isaiah, and he was a nurse who'd recently moved to our city from Oregon. She'd met him at a friend's cookout, and they'd bonded over their shared love of terrible reality TV shows. Watching Mallory fall in love was beautiful because Isaiah clearly adored everything about her, including the parts that didn't fit Colin's stupid checklist. He loved that she was outspoken and ambitious and wanted a big career. He supported her dreams instead of trying to shape her into some idealized version of a wife. The four of us started hanging out together, and it felt so natural. Kieran and Isaiah became friends, and we'd have game nights where we'd all argue loudly about strategy and laugh until our stomachs hurt. This was what relationships were supposed to be: partnership and support and genuine affection without scorecards or comparisons. I felt like I'd finally found my people after wasting years trying to be enough for someone who'd already decided I wasn't. A year after my breakup with Colin, Imani called me with gossip she'd heard through mutual friends. Colin was engaged to a woman named Bethany who looked exactly like the checklist description. Blonde, religious, wanted to be a stay-at-home mom, always agreeable. Imani said their mutual friends felt bad for Bethany because Colin was clearly just checking boxes again instead of actually connecting with a person. I felt a pang of sympathy for Bethany, who probably had no idea about Colin's scoring system, but mostly I felt relieved that I'd escaped before wasting more years being measured against impossible standards. I told Imani I hoped it worked out for them, but I didn't really mean it. I hoped Bethany found Colin's journal and left him just like I did. Some people don't deserve happy endings when they refuse to see other people as fully human. Kieran and I moved in together after dating for a year and a half. Mallory and Isaiah got engaged around the same time and asked us to be in their wedding party. Life felt full and happy in a way it never had with Colin. I'd thought I was happy during those 3 years, but looking back, I could see how much energy I'd spent trying to prove myself worthy of Colin's love. With Kieran, I didn't have to prove anything. I could just exist as myself, and that was not only accepted but celebrated. Mallory's wedding was beautiful and emotional. During her vows, she thanked Isaiah for loving her exactly as she was without trying to change her or mold her into someone else. I caught her eye, and we both smiled because we knew what she was really saying. We'd both found partners who saw us as whole people instead of checklists to be scored. That night at the reception, Kieran pulled me onto the dance floor and said he wanted to talk about our future. My heart started racing because I'd been thinking the same thing. 2 years after leaving Colin, Kieran proposed to me at the same coffee shop where Mallory and I had first really talked and become friends. He said that place represented new beginnings and second chances, and he wanted to start our marriage journey there. The ring was simple and perfect, and nothing like the flashy 3-carat diamond Colin had given me. When Kieran slid it onto my finger, I felt completely certain this was right. There were no scores or comparisons or secret doubts, just two people who'd chosen each other completely. We called Mallory immediately, and she screamed so loud that people in the coffee shop turned to stare. She and Isaiah came over that night with champagne, and we celebrated together. Mallory hugged me tight and whispered that she was so glad I'd found my person. I told her I was glad too, and that in a weird way I was grateful for Colin's journal because it led me to leave and eventually find both Kieran and her friendship. Planning my wedding to Kieran was completely different from planning the wedding to Colin that never happened. Kieran had opinions about everything and wanted to be involved in every decision. We argued about cake flavors and debated centerpiece options and laughed through the entire process. There was no sense of him just going along with whatever I wanted or secretly wishing I was someone else. We were building our wedding together as a team. Mallory was my maid of honor, and she helped me find a dress that made me feel beautiful exactly as I was. Dark hair, short height, opinionated personality, and all. The night before the wedding, Mallory and I sat up late in my hotel room talking about how far we'd both come. She said meeting me had changed her perspective on female friendship and made her realize women supporting each other was more powerful than competing for men's approval. I agreed and told her she'd helped me see my own worth again after Colin had spent years chipping away at it. My wedding day was perfect. Not perfect like a magazine spread or a Pinterest board, but perfect because it was authentically us. Kieran cried during his vows when he promised to never make me feel like I needed to change to earn his love. I cried during mine when I promised to trust that I was enough just as I was. Our families and friends celebrated with us, and nobody was secretly wishing we were different people. After the reception, Kieran and I went back to our hotel room, and he pulled out a gift he said he'd been saving. It was a blank journal with a note on the inside cover. He'd written, "For all the beautiful moments we'll create together. No checklists required, just us being perfectly imperfect together." I started crying again, and Kieran held me while I explained why a blank journal meant so much more than he probably realized. He said he knew about Colin's scoring system because Mallory had told Isaiah who'd told him. He wanted to give me a new journal that represented a fresh start with no judgments or measurements, just blank pages to fill with our real life together. 3 years after leaving Colin, I was having lunch with Mallory when she casually mentioned she'd heard Colin got divorced. Apparently, Bethany had found his old journals and left him after 6 months of marriage. The news didn't make me feel vindicated or happy. It just made me sad that another woman had wasted time being measured against Colin's impossible standards. Mallory said Colin had been trying to reconnect with old friends and rebuild his reputation, but most people had heard what he'd done and wanted nothing to do with him. She said he'd reached out to her again last month asking if they could talk, and she'd blocked him permanently this time. I asked if she felt bad for him at all. She thought about it and said no. She felt bad for the women he'd hurt and would probably keep hurting until he did serious work on himself. But Colin had made his choices, and those choices had consequences. We finished lunch and went back to our lives without spending any more mental energy on someone who'd never really seen either of us clearly. Kieran and I celebrated our second wedding anniversary by going back to that coffee shop where he'd proposed. We sat at our usual table and ordered our usual drinks and talked about our life together. He mentioned wanting to buy a house and maybe get a dog. I mentioned getting a promotion at work and feeling really proud of what I'd built in my career. Neither of us mentioned Colin or checklists or scores. That part of my life felt like it belonged to a different person entirely. The woman I was now knew her worth and wouldn't accept being someone's consolation prize. The woman I was now had real friends like Mallory who supported and celebrated her instead of competing with her. The woman I was now was married to someone who'd never asked her to be anyone other than exactly who she was. As Kieran held my hand across the table and smiled at me with complete love and acceptance, I realized I'd finally found what I'd been looking for all along. Not someone who scored me against a fantasy, but someone who chose me every day for exactly who I was. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.